Hello and welcome back to Soteriology 101. Today we're going to talk about equal ultimacy. Now we're getting into the weeds. When you get into these kinds of doctrines, it kind of sounds like the infralapsarian, supralapsarian controversies within the Reformed tradition. Why? Because when you introduce determinism within the scriptures, you have a lot of controversial doctrines and issues that come up, and this is when it gets into the weeds, meaning it gets complicated. Determinism is a pretty flat, simple to understand system. Basically, God decreed everything, and everything happens exactly how he decreed it. It's just determinism. That's pretty flat. Where it becomes complicated and convoluted is when you try to make determinism fit within Scripture. And all of the passages that say that God has nothing to do with evil, and that he's holy, and he's righteous, and he's good, and that pride and lust are not from the Father, but from the world. And you've got all these passages where he talks about, I did not decree it, nor did it even enter my mind, and all these kinds of things like this. Then you have to have some way of explaining how determinism fits within a world view that Scripture presents of God allowing men to make real choices, being really responsible creatures, and how all of that works together. Well, equal ultimacy is one of those doctrines within the Calvinistic tradition that is necessary in order for Calvinists to deal with these issues. And this has to do with the way in which God decrees and brings about his purposes and his plans. Now, I've argued, I see no real distinction with a difference between what Calvinism is claiming and what equal ultimacy is. Okay. In other words, R.C. Sproul and others denounce equal ultimacy as heretical, but yet I see no real distinction with a difference between the claims of equal ultimacy and the claims of compatibilistic deterministic Calvinism. Now, that's my argument. I understand that Calvinists would disagree with me. I understand that R.C. Sproul and others who make this delineation would disagree with my conclusions. This is why we sometimes have to be careful about differentiating between accusing people of making a claim versus accusing people based upon the logical implications of those claims. And that's why sometimes this becomes a shouting match. I don't believe that. Yes, you do. If you believe this, and you have to believe that. That's arguing the logical implication of a system. So I think Roger Olson put it really well in his discussion with Michael Horton when he said, in effect, I can't be a Calvinist because I understand, Dr. Horton, you don't believe God is evil. You don't believe God is duplicitous. You don't believe those things, and you're a Calvinist. But if I were to adopt Calvinism, Roger Olson says, then logically, I would have to believe that God was evil and duplicitous, which is the reason I reject Calvinism. And what is he arguing? He says the logical implications of the claims of your system would necessarily lead him to adopt a view that he doesn't believe is true about God. And that's one of the reasons we reject the Calvinistic conclusions and the claims of their system with regard to theistic determinism, i.e., God determines whatsoever comes to pass. And so let me let R.C. Sproul define for us what equal ultimacy is before we look at quotes from John Calvin himself, because I think it is demonstrably true that John Calvin did in fact teach doctrine that's equally ultimate. In other words, he did teach equal ultimacy, at least in some of his writings. Now, they're like in anybody's writings, like especially like Spurgeon and other Calvinists, well-known Calvinists, you can find quotes that seem to support both sides of the issue. Limited atonement, for example. There's many papers that have been written that try to demonstrate that John Calvin never actually believed in a limited atonement. And so, and others who claim that he did, and based upon different quotes, it can sound like he, in some instances, did support limited atonement, in other instances, he didn't. It could be similar with this, but I'm going to be just focusing on some very direct teachings from Calvin's Institutes as well as from his book on predestination, because after all, that would be where he's trying to give clarity to his dogmatic and how he works these things out. So let's look at this from R.C. Sproul first and foremost. Add that to the stream there. This is from R.C. Sproul, again, from Ligonier Ministries, and he's defining the heresy. Now, he's the one who calls it a heresy, so I'm not just calling people who, I'm not trying to shout him down as a heretic, this kind of thing. Heresy is a false teaching in his vernacular, and so he's saying this is a heresy of equal ultimacy, and he defines it, quote, equal ultimacy is the belief that God works in the same way and same manner with respect to the elect and to the reprobate. That is to say, from all eternity, God decreed some to election, and by divine initiative works faith in their hearts and brings them actively to salvation. By the same token, from all eternity, God decrees some to sin and damnation, and actively intervenes to work sin in their lives, bringing them to damnation by a divine initiative. In the case of the elect, regeneration is a monergistic work of God. In the case of reprobate, sin and degradation are monergistic work of God. This distortion of positive predestination clearly makes God the author of sin, who punishes a person for doing what God monergistically and irresistibly coerces man to do. Such a view is indeed a monstrous assault on the integrity of God. This is not the Reformed view of predestination, but a gross and inexcusable caricature of the doctrine. Such a view may be identified with what is often loosely described as hyper-Calvinism and involves a radical form of superlapsarianism. Such a view of predestination has been virtually universally and monolithically rejected by Reformed thinkers, end quote. Now, again, what is R.C. Sproul saying? Well, let's listen to a actual question answer time of R.C. Sproul, the late R.C. Sproul. He's obviously gone on to be with the Lord now, and he knows better now, by the way, I like to say. I think he is converted to provisionism now that he is in heaven. But nevertheless, here's a question answer time that he did fairly recently, where he answers the question about double predestination in its relationship to the concept of equal ultimacy. Let's watch this.
What is double predestination?
There's a lot of misunderstanding about double predestination. There are some communities that believe in what they call single predestination, meaning that God has eternally decreed to save certain people that he's appointed for salvation, and that is the elect. But as for the rest, he simply passes over and still holds out the opportunity for those people to be saved. Now, often, double predestination is expressed in what we call a synergistic fashion, or a fashion that is called positive decrees. In this respect, double predestination would mean that God positively decrees and determines in advance those whom he will save, namely the elect, and in the same method, he decrees the damnation of the sinner, and that just as on the one hand, he creates positively saving faith in the hearts of the elect, he, in an equally determinative fashion, creates fresh evil in the hearts of the reprobate to make sure they don't come to belief. Now, that is not the Reformed doctrine of double predestination. Reformed theology does teach double predestination in so far as that not everybody will be saved. And so it's double or nothing, really. You can't have single predestination and just ignore the non-elect, or unless you're a universalist. But the distinction is this: we had what we call a positive negative decree, or an asymmetrical view of election. I have an essay on this whole subject in the Festschrift that was written for John Gerstner several years ago, where I wrote extensively on the subject of double predestination. But the positive negative says that God positively involves himself in working faith and creating faith in the hearts of the elect, while he simply passes over the non-elect without forcing them into unbelief or creating any kind of fresh evil in them. So it's positive in the one hand, where he intervenes to create faith; negative in the other hand, where he doesn't intervene and create fresh evil. I hope that clarifies it a little bit.
Okay. And so hopefully you can hear very clearly from a Reformed scholar who knows John Calvin's teaching pretty well what he believes is Reformed theology with regard to the doctrine of equal ultimacy. Now, here's part of my problem, going back to the quote from R.C. Sproul before we jump into Calvin's quotes. Notice what he says here in his quote: "This distortion of positive predestination clearly makes God the author of sin, who punishes a person for doing what God monergistically and irresistibly coerces man to do." Now, here's where I think there's a distinction without a difference. Why is it coercing a man to do it if he's doing what he wants to do, Calvinist? In other words, when a person comes to saving faith, y'all always say he's not being forced to come to saving faith. He wants to come to saving faith because he's doing what he wants to do. And God changes his nature to make him want to do it. So he's not being coerced to come to faith. So how is that not the same whenever somebody chooses to reject the faith, reject Christ? He's not being forced to reject Christ. He's doing what he wants to do by his nature that he was decreed to have from birth. So either you're decreed to have a desire from God to hate God and then given a new desire to love him, or you're not. And in either case, neither one of them can be called coercion according to your own doctrinal system. This is why this is a distinction without a difference. This is just a smokescreen, in my opinion. Now, you can try to explain to me how it's different, but I see no distinction with a difference. A person born under the decree of the fall of Adam, without any control over that, is born with a nature and a desire that hates and rejects the things of God, including the gospel, unless God steps in and intervenes and gives him a new nature that he has no control over either, and causes him to want to desire to accept the gospel. Why would you call that coercion in either case, Calvinist? Even if it's God sovereignly and unchangeably decreeing it before the child's ever born. Again, this is where it's just a smokescreen. It is just it's a way in which Calvinists can say, yo, you can't accuse us of that. You don't understand Calvinism. It doesn't give any practical distinction with the difference, ultimately. And the namesake of your system did, in my estimation, and I'm going to prove it, and I'm going to show it to you, did, in my estimation, teach this quote-unquote heresy, what Sproul calls a heresy of equal ultimacy. I'm not the only one who came to this conclusion, by the way. Someone posted this on the website earlier from John Murray, who's a well-known Calvinistic Baptist from years past. And he came to the same conclusion. He says, in the esteem of Calvin, is the passing over or rejection of the non-elect as eternal and as sovereign, in that sense as ultimate as the choosing of the elect to eternal salvation? It appears to me that the frequency and clarity with which Calvin deals with this question leave no doubt that the answer must be affirmative. The sovereign will of God as the highest and ultimate cause is just as rigorously posited in reprobation as it is in election. And if the formula, quote, the equal ultimacy of election and reprobation, end quote, is intended to denote this precise consideration, then there can be no room for hesitation in asserting that Calvin would have subscribed to that formula. So what's John Murray's conclusion? Calvin did subscribe to the formula of equally ultimate election and reprobation in this regard. And so, again, this is not just my conclusion. Other Calvinistic scholars have come to the conclusion that Calvin, at least partially, if not holistically, did teach this doctrine. Let's go to another quote from John Calvin. He wrote this: how foolish and frail is the support of divine justice afforded by the suggestion that evils come to be not by his will, but by his permission. Now, let that sink in. What he's calling people foolish and frail who use the term permission instead of by his will. In other words, if you think divine justice is afforded by the suggestion that evils, and he's talking about evils, come to be by not his will, but his permission, then you're foolish and frail. So when we read from John Piper the other day, where he says that God plans to permit, then John Calvin would have called John Piper foolish and frail. Now, let me just interject here real quick. Let's push pause before we go on to the rest of this quote. Okay. Because when I was a Calvinist, I hadn't hardly read any of the Calvin's Institutes. And I wasn't a Calvinist because of what John Calvin did. In fact, because what I knew of Servetus, what I knew of John Calvin's beliefs about other doctrines with regard to infant baptism and other things like that, I would often say, as I hear many Calvinists that I relate to today say, well, I wouldn't necessarily call myself a Calvinist because there's a lot of things about Calvin's teaching and his dealings with people and things that I would want to not associate with. And so oftentimes Calvinists aren't called or wanting to be called Calvinists based upon the teachings directly of John Calvin. Okay. I get that. I understand that. I make that qualification quite regularly on this program, in fact, and baffled whenever Calvinists accuse me of not recognizing that truth. And so Calvinists are not Calvinists in the sense that they affirm and agree with everything John Calvin said or wrote. Okay, we all get that. Same with John Piper. There's a lot of Calvinists who don't like John Piper much. There's a lot of Reformed Baptists that don't think that Piper's nearly reformed enough. Okay. So just because John Piper or John Calvin teach something doesn't necessarily mean it's representative of all Calvinistic scholarship or Calvinistic believers, period. And it doesn't prove that it's wrong because somebody did something evil and therefore their doctrines must be wrong. Well, that guy used to be a slave owner that's a racist. Therefore, his belief about this scripture verse must be wrong. No. You can draw doubt upon somebody's judgment based upon those kinds of things. So you can make it as a part of the argument, but you cannot conclude that because a person had bad character in one particular regard or a bad interpretation in this regard, that therefore every other interpretation or every other belief that this person held to must also be in error. That's just bad argumentation. And so we are not promoting bad argumentation. And when people go around saying, well, Calvin killed Servetus, therefore you should not listen to anything Calvin said, then that falls on deaf ears with Calvinists, because Calvinists aren't Calvinists because of John Calvin. It's just the name. It's just a label. Okay. People need to understand that. Now, why is it relevant then to even talk about the namesake Calvinism? Why is it relevant to talk about what John Piper and other leading Calvinists say? Well, because you have to start somewhere whenever you're approaching the particular doctrinal system. And so when people accuse me, you don't understand Calvinism, I often have to say, well, no, I actually probably understand Calvinism more than you do, because I've been studying it my entire adult life. I was a Calvinist for a large portion of my adult life. And more than likely, I've read more of Calvin than you ever have. And I've probably read more Calvinistic scholars than you'll ever read, because I've been doing this my entire adult life. I'm not trying to talk down to them on that. It's just a fact of the matter. I mean, when you do your doctoral dissertation on this topic and create a podcast where you talk about these things on a regular basis, you just happen to probably read a lot more than the average person does with regard to these doctrines. Just like a podiatrist is going to know more about feet than the average person. Doesn't mean you don't know anything about feet. It just means the podiatrist probably knows a lot more about feet than you happen to know about feet. And it's not a slap against your intelligence. You might have a lot higher IQ than your podiatrist, but your podiatrist has studied a lot more about feet than you have, right? Okay, well, I'm a soteriologist, so to speak. I studied a lot about the doctrines of salvation and Calvinism and the teachings of Calvin. So more than likely, I know more about Calvinism than you do. So don't accuse me of not understanding Calvinism. And if you're going to do anything, you might accuse me of not understanding your unique form of Calvinism, whatever that may be, because you have buffet-styled Calvinism in such a way as to accept the things you want to accept and reject the things you don't want to accept. And you may appeal to mystery in different places than John Calvin appealed to mystery with regard to his particular belief systems. We've got some self-proclaimed Calvinists that affirm some aspects of the tulip theology who advocate for libertarian free will. Go figure. How in the world does that work? I would love to have Kokel or some of these guys on who claim to be Calvinistic soteriologically, but still affirm libertarian freedom of the will, and how that works. These are the kinds of things that we have to kind of tiptoe through when we're talking to people who disagree with us on these subjects. And you have to be good Bereans. You have to be well-educated, and you have to step lightly when trying to represent other perspectives. But I tend to try to deal with the most influential leading scholars of that particular worldview. And right now, John Piper arguably is the most influential Calvinist, at least in my denomination of Southern Baptist. The Piperites are far and wide. There are a lot of Piperites out there, as they call them. The 7-point Calvinist out there, as he even calls himself, a 7-point Calvinist. The influence of John Piper is very deep and wide in our society today, in our culture today. And so I am trying to confront that form of Calvinism, but I'm also trying to help people to understand historically these debates continually to rise up and tend to, in my experience and from what I've read, they tend to be the very things that destroy the Calvinism that is rising today. And even Phil Johnson of Grace to You Ministries, who is a pretty well-known Calvinistic scholar, admits that Calvinism has a tendency to become hyper, and eventually it eats its own and it destroys the movement. And so Calvinism resurges back up and it dies back out. Why? Because it's eaten up by hyper-Calvinism. Because, in my estimation, it's because it's not a logically tenable way of living life, and it's not a systematic that logically works, and therefore it logically implodes upon itself is what's happening. I guess the Calvinists would believe God decrees for it to rise up and die back out. I'm not sure, but nevertheless, the systematic itself, I don't think stands the test of logic or theological hermeneutic. I don't think it has a good backing for the belief system. Now, with that said, let's go back to the quote. How foolish and frail is the support of divine justice, afforded by the suggestion that evils come to be not by his will, but by his permission. Now, the ellipsis there is just skipping a portion of the quotes. It's not trying to hide anything. Go back and read it in its entirety. I fully encourage people to read the context in its entirety. In fact, somebody was pointing out on the Facebook page, usually when you read Calvin in his context, it even better supports the point we're making. So I encourage you to go read Calvin in his context, because you will go, oh, wow, he went a lot further than I thought he went. There's a lot in Calvin's commentary in the context that even goes further than what you may think. And so here he starts quoting, and he actually says here in that ellipsis, he says he's in agreement with Augustine, and now he's going and quoting in favor and in support of Augustine's work, where Augustine actually said this portion of the quote. He says, it is quite frivolous refuge to say God obtusely permits them when Scripture shows them not only willing but the author of them. That may still be Calvin there. It's now, I think, this next one that's Augustine. Calvin is quoting from Augustine here. Who does not tremble at these judgments, which God works in the hearts of even the wicked, whatever he will? Now, if that's not equal ultimacy, I don't know what is. Okay, how we tremble at the judgments? What God works in the hearts of even the wicked, whatever he wills. Now, you just heard R.C. Sproul call it a heresy to say that God works evil into man, but yet you hear here God works in the hearts of even the wicked, whatever he will, rewarding them nonetheless according to desert. In other words, still punishing them deservingly for what he works in them. Again, it is quite clear from the evidence of Scripture that God works in the hearts of men to incline their wills just as he will, whether to good for his mercy's sake or to evil according to their merits. In other words, according to evil, God works in the hearts of men to incline their wills to evil. Okay? Just as he will. That is, in every sense of the word, equal ultimacy as far as I can understand it. I don't know how that's not equal ultimacy. There are many other quotes. And in fact, before we look, let's look at other quotes of equal ultimacy from John Calvin. He also says, many professing the desire to defend the deity from an individual charge, this is Calvin, admit the doctrine of election, but deny that anyone is reprobated. This they do ignorantly and childishly, since there could be no election without its opposite, reprobation. Again, from the Institutes of Christian Religion, John Calvin. So what is he calling ignorant and childish? Those who try to say election's true, but not reprobation. And that's not what R.C. Sproul said, by the way. R.C. Sproul actually argued for both election and reprobation. What he's denying is that God is somehow working in the same way, equally with the elect and the reprobate. But again, I see no distinction with a difference if you've got God's decree ultimately deciding beyond the person's control their nature from birth so that they're doing what they want. So there is never any coercion. Even on the equal ultimacy model, there is no coercion. A person's doing what they want to do. So I don't understand how that could possibly be. Now, here is some more quotes that will help us to see John Calvin's particular view on this subject. But those, while they profess to be disciples of Christ, again, this is from Calvin, still seek for free will in man, notwithstanding of his being lost and drowned in spiritual destruction, labor under the manifold delusion, making heterogeneous mixture of inspired doctrine and philosophical opinions, so erring us to both. Continuing, creatures are so governed by the secret counsel of God that nothing happens but what he has knowingly and willingly decreed. Continuing, we hold that God is the disposer and ruler of all things, and that from the remotest eternity, according to his own wisdom, he decreed what he was to do, and now by his power executes what he has decreed. Hence we maintain that by his providence, not heaven and earth and inanimate creatures only, but also the counsels and wills of men are so governed as to move exactly in the course which he is destined. So the counsels and wills of men. So when the will of man is to molest a child, that will is governed to move exactly in the course which God has destined that molester to move. Again, I'm trying to take it out of the diadems of our theological think tanks and put it down into the rubber meets the road practical application of how these things work. When the molester thinks in his mind, I'm going to do this to this child, he is being governed by the God of the universe, the holy, holy, righteous one, to move exactly in the course which God has destined him to move, to molest, to hurt, to maim, to possibly even kill and eat that child, as has happened, obviously. Now, I know that's horribly, heinously emotional and evil, and it just brings horrible images to your mind. I know that, and I'm sorry that the image is in your brain now. I hate that it's there too. But these are the kinds of examples that philosophers and theologians like Piper and others use on their websites in order to help us to realize that this is true, yes, of even the most heinous, imaginable thing possible that you don't like to put into your brains and think about, because you've ultimately got God governing as to move exactly within the course that he has destined that man to do that, versus permitting evil people to act in evil ways and not stepping in to stop it. There's a big difference. Those are both problems. They're both a theodicy problem, the problem of evil. Why doesn't God step in to stop the molesters? That's still a problem, but it's a completely different question than why does God necessitate a molester to do that? Why does God determine a molester to do that? There's a big difference between why does God cause somebody to do that versus why doesn't God stop somebody who's choosing to do that freely. Different questions. And if you conflate the two and you go, oh, you too, you have the same problem because God didn't stop it. Nope. Different problem. It's still a problem, but it's a different problem. And there are many, many good apologists who have really good answers for the second one, while Calvinists sometimes are hiding from the first one while appealing to the second one. Not all Calvinists do, but some Calvinists use the U2 fallacy. And instead of answering the problem of determinism, they appeal to the problem of omniscience. And they say, well, you have the same problem too, because God knew it was going to happen. He didn't stop it. And that's not an answer to the problem. Okay. Thieves and murderers, Calvin says, and other evildoers are instruments of divine providence, being employed by the Lord himself to execute judgments which he is resolved to inflict, end quote. Continuing, the devil and the whole train of the ungodly are in all directions held in by the hand of God as with a bridle, so that they can neither conceive any mischief or plan what they have conceived, nor how much soever they may have planned, move a single finger to perpetrate, unless insofar as he permits, nay, unless insofar as he commands, that they are not only bound by his fetters, but are even forced to do him service. I thought coercion wasn't involved under equal ultimacy. And Calvin says they're forced to do him service. Just saying, I'm using their own words, okay? I'm letting you hear from their own lips. This is their writings on the subject. He testifies, Calvin's writing here, he testifies that he creates light and darkness, forms good and evil, and no evil happens which he hath not done. Let them tell me whether God exercises judgments willingly or unwillingly, end quote. Continuing, how few are there who, when they hear free will attributed to man, do not immediately imagine that he is the master of his mind and will, in such a sense that he can of himself incline himself either to do good or evil. See, he's making the same mistakes that we see Calvinists still making today, that they think that if we affirm free will, that therefore we're acting on our own without any initiative of God. No, we've always said we are responders. It's a big difference between being somebody who is in bondage to sin, who responds to God's appeals to be reconciled from that bondage, versus acting out on our own, inclining ourselves to do good without any help from God. Because that's oftentimes the false dilemma that Calvinists will paint, is either we're acting under the deterministic will of God, or we're acting out on an island all by ourselves without any help from God at all. And that's not, either one of those are true. The truth is usually found in the happy middle. And the happy middle is that God initiates, that God grants, that God enables, but that we're responsible for the gifts that God gives us. My next breath is a gift from God. The ability to trust and believe in him is a gift from God. Faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. I can't believe apart from him. How can they believe in one whom they've not heard? I can do nothing without him. I have no hope of salvation without him. But when he steps in, he initiates, he provides. Now I'm responsible for his provision. I'm responsible for the gift he's given me. I'm responsible for how I use that next breath that I take, even though he's given me the gift of that breath. I'm responsible. That's the happy medium between determinism and this namby-pamby weird thing that supposedly a bunch of people believe, but nobody really does. And that's why Calvinists, I think, have been so successful, is they've painted people into a false dilemma corner that you have to choose between this version of that nobody really ever believes, that God's not active at all, and that people are acting totally on their own, and that they are completely autonomous and have no help from God whatsoever, versus this side over here of ultimate determinism of all things. I'm saying, no, let's not go with either one of those. Let's go with the biblical middle. Let's go with a happy medium there. We could go on to read on that point. Going on, salvation is freely offered, Calvin says, to some, while others are barred from access to it. We call predestination, Calvin says, God's eternal decree by which he compacted with himself whatever he willed to become of each man. For all are not created on equal condition. Rather, eternal life is foreordained for some, eternal damnation for others, end quote. The very equality of his grace proves that it's free. We say that God once established by his eternal and unchangeable plan those whom he long before determined once for all to receive unto salvation, and those whom, on the other hand, he would devote to destruction. He has barred the door of life to those whom he has given over to damnation, end quote. God could foresee nothing good in man except what he had already determined to bestow by the benefit of his election, end quote. Another one, quote, God is moved to mercy for no other reason, but he wills to be merciful. Another quote, predestination to glory is the cause of predestination to grace, rather than the converse. Although the voice of the gospel addresses all in general, yet the gift of faith is rare. Another quote, we cannot assign any reason for his bestowing mercy on his people, but just as he so pleases him. Neither can we have any reason for his reprobating others, but his will. That's what we would call arbitrary, and even what Calvin referred to as an arbitrary will of God. Therefore, those whom God passes over, he condemns, and he does so for no other reason that he wills to exclude them from the inheritance which he predestines for his own children. Now, you can see why I see no distinction with the difference between what R.C. Sproul defined as the heresy of equal ultimacy and what we read over and over and over again from Calvin himself. And when you look at how Romans 9 is exegeted and interpreted by Calvinistic scholars, I am baffled as to how you can avoid an equal ultimacy with the concept of how you understand Jacob and Esau. If you understand, as it says here in the text, not only so, beginning verse 10 of chapter 9, but when Rebekah conceived children by one man, our forefather Isaac, though they were not yet born and had done neither good or bad, in order that God's purpose and election might stand, not because of works, but because of him who calls, she was told the older will serve the younger, as is written, Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. For what shall we say then? There is no injustice on God's part, is there? By no means, for he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. And then later he goes on to say, I'll have mercy on, he hardens whomever he wills. He has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. Now, what is the typical Calvinistic interpretation of this passage? Well, Jacob is the elect. He is chosen unto salvation. Esau is a representative of the reprobate. He is chosen unto damnation. And God can have mercy on whom he wants to have mercy, like he has mercy on Jacob, and he can harden whom he wants to harden, which is representative of Esau. Now, if you're going to mercy somebody and harden somebody, as James White puts it in his book, that's an active verb of God. He's going to mercy people and he's going to harden people. How is that not equal ultimacy? He's actively working to reprobate Esau before Esau did any sin, before he did anything bad. So he's actively choosing to reprobate somebody who hasn't done anything bad yet, he's not even foreseeing the bad according to this exegetical principle of the Calvinists. Now, for those of you who are just tuning into this particular broadcast, go to my other broadcast on how we interpret Romans chapter 9, how we understand this as representative of the nations that are in the womb, and that Paul is using this as an example to show and to demonstrate how God's promise and his purpose has not failed in choosing Israel to be the means by which the Messiah would come, and that God's purposes is actually being fulfilled in the hardening of Israel. And that Israel can be shown mercy when it serves his purpose to show them mercy, and God's purpose and promise is fulfilled when he hardens Israel. Just like he hardened Pharaoh to bring about the first Passover, he can harden Israel to bring about the second Passover. And who are we to question God if he, in his ultimate plan, chooses to show them mercy like he does at the golden calf incidents? He doesn't destroy them when they deserve to be destroyed, which is what mercy is. And he can choose to harden them like he's doing in Paul's day, so as to bring about the crucifixion and the ingrafting of the Gentiles. And who are you to question God if he wants to shape his clay and this spoiled lump of clay called Israel and shape it into a different use so as to bring about his purposes and his plans through their rebellious actions? Who are you to question it? That's what we believe he's talking about here. But the Calvinist applies this like a Westerner typically does and makes it all about individuals, and makes it about individuals either being chosen unconditionally for salvation, or you would have to assume unconditionally for reprobation. But how the Calvinists can say you're unconditionally, monergistically chosen for salvation without having Esau also unconditionally being reprobated for damnation is baffling, to say the least, and is certainly inconsistent hermeneutic, if nothing else. It's just ad hoc claim. Oh, no. Jacob is not unconditional. I mean, Jacob is unconditionally and monergistically caused to be an elect, but not Esau. No, Esau's not unconditionally and sovereignly brought to reprobation. No, we can't have that, because that is obviously heretical. So we can't have that. So what do we do? Just ad hoc claim? No. It doesn't apply the same to Esau as it does to Jacob. Based on what? Sproul's writings? Superlapsarian's writings? What Bible verse are you going to define this? You just ad hoc claim that you're going to interpret this text individually when it suits your purpose and not individually when it doesn't suit your purpose? Good luck with that. Talk about an inconsistent hermeneutic. That's why we're pushing back on these things. You got to see I think the logical inconsistency of the Calvinistic reading overall in order to understand why we should reject this concept from the very beginning. Plus, as Troy points out, hatred is not the opposite of love in the text. It's exactly right. We talked about hatred, like he says in John, that to be my disciple, you must hate your mother and father, your loved ones, in order to follow me. What's he saying? You must choose me over your loved ones, just like I chose Jacob over Esau to be the lineage through which the Messiah would come. And my promise has not failed in that choice, and it's coming to pass. And it may seem like it because the people who are of Israel, Jacob, are rejecting their Messiah, but actually it's in their rejection that his purpose is being fulfilled. And that's the point that Paul is getting to in Romans 9 through 11. The same ones who are hardened are the same ones he said have stumbled, but have not stumbled beyond recovery in chapter 11, verse 11. The same ones he said could be provoked to envy and be grafted back in if they leave their unbelief in chapter 11. So they're certainly not the reprobates of the Calvinistic system that have no hope of salvation. They are stumbling, but not beyond recovery. They can still be saved, so they're not without hope. So we have to understand the whole of the text, not just portions of it that suit our particular doctrinal pet doctrine, i.e., determinism, theistic determinism, like Calvinists hold to. All right, so I'm trying to. Oh yeah, Troy is saying that I popped up. I pulled him into a middle of a conversation between somebody else. Yes, I apologize. Sometimes that happens where I pull a quote in and you're actually responding to somebody else. So I wasn't trying to misrepresent anybody. I was agreeing with what you were saying, actually, that hatred should not be taken in that way. And I think you were making the right point. Okay, Danny's saying, take your Calvinist friends to a potter shop. After a few minutes at the kick wheel, they will begin to understand the potter's metaphor. Regardless, the God of Calvin is not the God of the Bible. Calvinists are. Oh wait. Okay, now this is actually good. I'm glad I pulled this in here because Danny, let me address this. I get a lot of followers that make comments in the chat. I usually try to avoid promoting comments like this. I wouldn't have put it on there if I'd have read through the whole thing before I put it up. But I want to address this because I think this is so important for us to address. You can say on one hand, I believe Calvinism is false. The doctrines that John Piper teach are false with regard to Calvinism, okay? While at the same time not necessarily concluding that John Piper is not a believer, that he's not a Christian. I think that's possible. Some people think, oh, no, that's just impossible. You can't possibly believe the things that Calvinists believe and not be a Christian. Listen, I was a Calvinist. I affirmed tulip systematic for 10 years of my life. I know without a shadow of a doubt that I was just as saved during those 10 years as I was the 10 years prior and the 10 years after, and that I am now. Okay. I had a misunderstanding and a misinterpretation of some texts. I misunderstood what they were saying. And God's grace is bigger and greater than our misunderstandings. I don't believe that our open theist friends, which, by the way, some Calvinists are very adamantly opposed for me even having conversations with open theists because they're quote unquote heretics. And when I try to push them and say, okay, you think they're not going to heaven because they have a different view of the dynamics of God's infinite knowledge than you have, I disagree with them too. I think they're making the same fallacious conclusions that you're making under determinism, but I don't cast them out of the kingdom because of a philosophical distinction than what I hold to. And this is where we have to say we are saved by grace through faith. Is grace big enough to cover our misconceptions and misinterpretations of Romans 9, for example? Of course it is. Notice the Bible doesn't say you will know them by their doctrinal checklists. What's it say? You will know them by their love. You will know them by the fruit of their spirit. So is it possible for somebody to hold to Calvinistic doctrine and not be saved? Of course. Is it possible for somebody to hold to provisionistic doctrine and not be saved? Of course. But people are not saved based upon doctrinal fidelity on every single point of doctrine. People are saved by grace through faith. Listen, Rahab, think about her. She was an illiterate prostitute from a pagan nation, knew zip about the God of Israel, except that she feared him because she'd heard stories about what he did and what happened to Israelites, and she feared the God of Israel. And so what does she do? She hides the Israelite spies out of fear of Yahweh. And she makes the hall of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. You think she had a full understanding of the triune doctrine of the hypostonic union of Christ and all of the intricacies of how the knowledge and decrees of God work? And do you think she believed and affirmed in the omniscience or the lack of omniscience or one verse? She even thought about those things. Listen, God shows her mercy. God shows her love because he is a loving and gracious God who wants to show love and mercy. I don't believe he's casting people out of the kingdom based upon their doctrinal misunderstandings on these doctrines. And that's one of the reasons I refuse to be one of those kinds of non-Calvinists that shout down my Calvinistic brothers as being unbelievers. I can say with firmness, and I have on this program with firmness, I believe you are wrong with regard to how you're representing God because of your interpretation of Romans 9 and other passages. Very firm on that, without necessarily declaring, I know your intentions, I know your heart, I know the genuineness of your faith and trust in Christ as your Savior. I can't possibly know the heart of each individual Calvinist that I come across. And I challenge you, I implore you all, do not put yourself on the throne and start declaring whether you think somebody is truly saved or not based upon their doctrinal fidelity to disputable matters with regard to omniscience and sovereignty and the decrees of God and how all the soteriological doctrines play themselves out. I'm begging you to reconsider your approach and how you address Calvinists when it comes to standing up, yes, against what they're saying and teaching, without necessarily becoming the judge of whether they are believers or not. So just and help me with that. I can't police the internet. Okay, I don't have enough time in my day with 4 children, 3 of which the third's about to go into college, full-time director of evangelism and apologetics that I travel and preach, and I'm doing trainings and working with pastors and ministers across the state here in my job. And then on the side, also doing Soteriology 101. I don't have time to weed through all of the Facebook comments and all the places and correct people when they take this approach against our Calvinistic friends. I don't have time to do that. But yet I can't tell you how many times I've heard Calvinists dismiss me as if I am equivalent to those who follow and like my videos. I'm sorry, I can't be held responsible for your responses. Okay, that's the Calvinistic version of the world. I can't be held responsible for what people who agree with what I'm saying choose to say on all my videos or choose to comment on our Facebook pages. But I can on my videos, and I strive to do this on a regular basis. I can encourage those who follow this broadcast and to post. If you just feel it's your God-given call to shout down and to, bring rebuke to all the Calvinists out there, and you think you can do that by calling them heretics and doing the
what are you talking about?
Doing the whole there you go, idol killer.
Foreign religion. The free will of man is God. You've got some narcissism in you. You do.
I'm using my.
What you just heard was a heresy fest.
Okay, so that's the one I was looking for. You just heard a heresy fest. That's a heresy.
I teach hermeneutics. It is purely fallacious. It is not an argument. It is embarrassing.
Okay. That's the form of argumentation. The reason we make light of these kinds of things is that they're not arguments. And that's the level of argumentation that we stoop to when we just call everybody who disagrees with us a heretic. Instead, you may believe somebody is a heretic. You may believe somebody is teaching a heresy without treating them such that they're not going to be willing to hear you out and to help to convince them of these things and the truths of these things. So I having been a former Calvinist, I feel that my calling, what God has called me to do, at least in the context of this particular broadcast, is to help people to think deeper about these things, to help people to consider both sides, both scholarly perspectives, try to help Calvinists to recognize where they could be mistaken on some issues and some doctrines. And we've been quite successful at that. I get at least 2 or 3 messages a week of former Calvinists who said they've come out of Calvinism because of this broadcast, some of which they allow me to post, some of which they say, I'm still in the Calvinist church. Can you keep that secret? And so I've almost every time I see a Calvinist who's converted out of Calvinism, I'll type a message about, hey, can I post this? Or can I have you on the program? 90% of the time they decline because either one, they're shy and don't want to come on the program, or because they're still in a situation where they're trying to still maneuver the politics of that, so to speak, and to try to keep from harming their own relationships with other people. And they don't want to go public with their leaving of Calvinism. But we are being very successful, in my estimation, on bringing a lot of people who've formerly claimed to be Calvinists out of Calvinism and understanding why they need to leave Calvinism and why the Calvinistic interpretation falls short. And so, at least, guys, if you disagree with my approach, at least respect it. At least respect my desire to confront Calvinists in such a way that gives them the permission to abandon ship. Okay? Because if you attack somebody in their belief system, then usually it just cements them in that system. Okay, let me say that again. If you attack somebody who's holding to a particular system, and you attack them and that system, especially if you attack them personally, usually what you're doing is just cementing them in that worldview. I know this because it happened to me as a Calvinist. In fact, for the first several months of being introduced to Calvinism, I was fairly open to both sides at that time. I was fairly kind of trying to grapple with this. I just read a MacArthur book. I was 19 years old, and I was going, man, that does Romans 9 does kind of seem to say that, and Ephesians 1, man, especially when you've got a really articulate person like John MacArthur explaining these things to you, you're going, man, that sounds real, and you're kind of asking questions. And so I began to ask people that I respected who were more theologically trained than I was, just started asking them about it. Some of them I would run into that were Calvinist, and they would just continually affirm what I was coming to understand. But then when I would run into an Arminian, a non-Calvinist, 100% of them, I can't think of one exception, 100% of them would either quote John 3:16 and think that was the end-all be-all of the discussion, would not have hardly any kind of a theological answer for it, would give me anecdotal stories about how a Calvinist they once know is selling cars now, would dismiss it, kind of pat my head and say, well, you have to work through that and figure it out yourself, kind of thing. not a single one of them in that first probably full year of me still kind of grappling with these doctrines ever was able to give me any kind of cogent theological explanation as to why somebody wouldn't accept the Calvinistic reading of Romans 9 or Ephesians 1. Usually it was a volleying of text. Oh, well, yeah, it says that over there, but it also says this over here. There's just kind of a tension, maybe. It's just, seems contradictory, but, the Bible doesn't contradict itself, so we know it's not contradictory, but it seems that way, and we're just going to accept the tension of it. There's two rails that meet in eternity, Leighton. There's just they're parallel lines, and they meet in eternity, and we just don't get it. You just got to kind of accept both of them as true. Everything about my upbringing and teaching and logic just screamed, that's not the way it works. You can't commit the law of self-contradiction, and I appreciate Piper because he even admits that you can't do that. And he actually critiques people like J.I. Packer and other Calvinists that try to go that line. And so why am I getting, what am I getting to? I'm trying to understand and try to help people to understand that when we're confronting Calvinism and confronting Calvinists, if we want to be effective at doing that, which I think I've had some effect in doing that, some success in my effect against, it's one of the reasons people ask me, why do you continue to respond to James White, especially the way he treats you and all the disrespect, blah, 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 blah. Why do you continue? Matter of fact, somebody was bringing it up in the side chat over here. Why do you even engage with James White, given these things that he's done and he's said and all this stuff? And I said, well, James White is the gift that keeps on giving when it comes to converting Calvinists, because every internet Calvinist that I know of knows of James White and has some level of respect for James White. And so when James White throws something out there about me, and I have a chance to rebut or to explain where he's mistaken, I get the ear of another Calvinist or two or three or four or five or 10 or 1,000 or whatever it may be, right? And of those percentages of Calvinists out there, some of which are at least open-minded and intellectually and honest enough to reconsider their worldview, a percentage of them convert. They go, oh, wait a second. I hadn't thought of that before. I hadn't considered the concept of judicial hardening in the light of the way the provisionist explains these things. I hadn't recognized that logical inconsistency that Leighton just pointed out. And it gets them thinking. And we've had several men on the program who have converted out of Calvinism. I remember years ago is the guy that was a missionary who was debating with one of his theological Calvinistic friends back home, and they were doing this back and forth, Twitter exchange or Facebook or email exchange back and forth with all these different Calvinistic, debates back and forth with each other. And the Calvinist sends him a link to the James White Romans 9 debate that we had and said, see, watch this, and sends it to Scott. And Scott watches it and goes, yeah, that Leighton did says exactly what I believe. That's exactly, did you watch the debate? Did you hear what he said? And so it's just like this Calvinist was so certain of his views that when he saw that debate, man, he just thought, man, James White just proves that Calvinism is true. And he sends it to this other guy. The other guy's going, no, that's exactly, that proves that Calvinism is false. Did you hear it again? And eventually, of course, as we well know from the interview, the Calvinist eventually sees it. And he eventually comes over to our side, so to speak, and even came on the program to do an interview with us. It happens. It can happen, believe it or not. Some people say, hey, can it ever work? Can Calvinists ever be convinced out of Calvinism? Yeah, it actually happens quite regularly, in fact, especially for the lower level Calvinists who don't really understand what the Calvinism entails, don't really get it all. They can come out of Calvinism, and they're a lot less likely to do so if you just shout them down, or you just call them a heretic, you just quote verses out at them, those kinds of things. That's not going to convince anyone. I think if anything's going to convince somebody out of Calvinism, it's going to be the same thing that convinced them to become a Calvinist. And that is usually deep exegetical, sound argumentation that's based in theology and logic and good reasoning and respectful conversation. I think those things are typically the types of characteristics you're going to see in the types of arguments that are going to win people out, which, by the way, is the same true in the apologetic world of winning atheists out of atheism. And that's a part of my field too. Part of what I study and what I want to see is the common denominator that I have seen in atheists who are won out of atheism into Christianity is typically done not by shouting them down, calling them names. It's by showing them respect, considering their argumentation, rationally, respectfully, showing them where their arguments fail, and slowly bringing them out of their misconceptions. And I see men like Braxton Hunter and Jonathan Pritchett and Eric Hernandez, who works with us there at Texas Baptist, our lead apologist, is masterful at cordially explaining to atheists where their atheism is illogical and where their arguments are flawed. And in doing so, not all that he talks to obviously are converted, but a good number of people begin to question their atheism, begin to question their logic, begin to question their reasoning, because someone takes the time to rationally explain the other side. And I'm not trying to equate Calvinists with atheists. Please don't hear that. What I'm saying is I'm equating the argument itself. When you make arguments, when you make a case for something, the manner in which you make that case is relevant. It's important. Sometimes just as important as the argument itself, because the content of the argument can be skewed by the manner in which it's presented. So if you've got a jerk who's just being mean and bombastic, making a really strong, good argument, oftentimes the manner in which he's making that very strong, good argument is lost in the manner in which it's made. And so the atheist or the other side, the opponent, doesn't even hear the soundness of the argument because he's too caught up in the anger and the vitriol by which the argument's being made. And so, guys, if we as non-Calvinists want to have any hope of convincing our Calvinistic friends, who tend to be more very studious and educational and intellectualistic, they tend to like good logic. They tend to like making non-fallacious arguments. They tend to be well-rounded in their studies as far as their understanding of various doctrines of the faith. And when you're logical and consistent and respectful to them, then they're a lot more likely to hear you out and reason with you about those things. Doesn't mean you're always going to convince them, because guess what? Free will's true. But it does mean that you're going to have a lot more chance in persuading them and winning them over, because you're not clouding the soundness of your argument with vitriolic disdain and disrespect. So again, I didn't mean to get on that soapbox in the ending of this particular broadcast, but I do think it's important for us to point that out and to help people to understand why we're doing what we're doing, and to understand why we can continue to point out these inconsistencies with regard to double predestination, equal ultimacy, the claims of John Calvin himself as opposed to and contradicted by, I think, men like R.C. Sproul, and why that inconsistency is important to understand how the logic of the system itself tends to crumble upon itself when looked at in its entirety. So hopefully this has been helpful. God bless. Help us spread the news of God's love and provision. Go to Sociology101.com, click on that support link at the top right corner. If you can become a monthly patron or make a one-time donation, click on that class link in order to learn more about Trinity Seminary and how to get a higher theological education online. God bless. See you soon. Bye-bye.